So you might have heard about this thing people talk about online sometimes. Organized stalking or gang stalking.
Yeah, definitely. And often the first thought, perhaps understandably, is, paranoia, maybe schizophrenia.
Right, that's the sort of traditional psychiatric viewpoint. If someone says they're being followed everywhere, harassed by groups, experiencing really weird stuff repeatedly, well, it fits certain diagnostic patterns.
It can, yeah. But is
Yeah.
that always the full picture?
Exactly. And that's what we're digging into today. We're looking at a perspective from Dr. Catherine Horton. She suggests that maybe, just maybe, jumping straight to that psychiatric conclusion could be, well, missing other potential explanations.
Things happening outside that specific medical field, you mean?
Precisely. And she points to something quite noticeable, this apparent explosion in these kinds of complaints over the last, 16 to 20 years.
Yeah, it does seem like more than just a few isolated cases. You hear more people reporting this feeling, this sensation of being systematically ganged up on,
Hmm.
experiencing these odd occurrences again and again.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to explore one of the other possible explanations Dr. Horton puts forward. It's not based on psychiatry, but her analysis of, well, current affairs, specifically looking at intelligence agency budgets.
Right. She talks about a couple of categories, but we're really focusing on the second one today, the one that maybe doesn't get talked about as much.
And it's important to say, like Dr. Horton does, that this doesn't mean every single report fits this second category.
Absolutely not. Standard psychiatric explanations will cover some cases, no doubt. But she's saying, hang on, could there be another reason for a significant chunk of these reports?
Okay, so let's unpack that. Dr. Horton's point is that while psychiatric knowledge is vast, it's mostly built on data from, previous decades.
And maybe it hasn't fully caught up with or doesn't account for major shifts happening elsewhere. Things you can actually see reported in the news, for example.
Exactly. And that's where she pivots to the money, specifically the budgets of intelligence agencies. She uses the UK's MI5 as a kind of case study.
A really striking one, actually. She highlights a pretty huge event in their funding.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty stark. Dr. Horton notes that MI5's budget essentially doubled back in 2003.
Doubled. And this isn't just her saying it, right? This was reported.
Oh yeah, The Guardian, other news outlets covered it at the time. A doubling of funds. That's a massive jump in resources.
And think about what that means. Dr. Horton argues that doubling the budget effectively gives you the financial clout to run a whole second organization, basically the same size as the original MI5.
Wow. The scale of that potential growth is huge.
It is, and she uses this analogy, maybe you can relate to it, about local councils. You know how sometimes towards the end of the financial year, they suddenly start fixing pavements or whatever?
Ah, yeah, the spend it or lose it
And
mentality.
to make sure they get the same budget next year? Dr. Horton suggests big organizations, including intelligence agencies, face similar pressures, get a sudden flood of cash. You got to find ways to use it, and quickly.
Okay, that makes sense. So if you suddenly have double the money.
The most logical thing, Dr. Horton suggests, is you start hiring fast. You need people to spend that money to do the work.
So a big recruitment drive for agents, informants, that kind of thing.
Seems likely, yeah.
Yeah.
And she considers who might be available for that kind of work. Maybe people who are unemployed, younger people not in jobs, even pensioners looking to supplement their income.
People who might need the work and be open to, let's say, less conventional tasks.
Potentially, yes. And that leads to the next bit. What would these new recruits be trained in? What are the tools of the trade, as she puts it?
And this is where it connects back to those reports of stalking, isn't it?
Right on. Dr. Horton lists the skills. Surveillance, obviously, like physically following people, bugging, putting listening devices in cars, phones, houses,
Okay.
monitoring movements closely,
Right.
and even setting up controlled situations like weird street theater scenes, maybe to provoke a reaction or just gather intel.
Disconcerting stuff.
Yeah.
Designed to observe and maybe influence people.
Exactly. So here's the core of her hypothesis. Could the rise in these stalking reports be a sort of side effect of this rapid intelligence agency expansion?
You mean all these new recruits need training?
Uh-huh. And training requires practice. Practice on someone.
So she's suggesting that maybe some people reporting these experiences aren't actual intelligence targets.
But are unwittingly being used as essentially test subjects for training exercises.
Wow. That's quite a thought.
It is. And she makes an interesting distinction. She says, look, if someone reports being stalked by, fairies or space aliens, That might lean more towards traditional paranoia.
Okay.
But if the reports describe being followed or harassed by, say, groups of young adults or maybe older people, that starts to align more with the demographics she suggested might be recruited.
The unemployed, young people, pensioners.
Yeah. The logic, she argues, is kind of grimly practical. Training raw recruits on actual dangerous terrorists or hardened criminals,
Yeah.
that's risky for the trainees.
Right. They could get hurt or blow the operation.
Yeah. Precisely. So it might be seen as safer, more practical, to practice these surveillance and harassment techniques on individuals perceived as, well, harmless.
People unlikely to have powerful connections or fight back effectively.
Sufficiently less well-connected, is how she puts it. People who probably won't cause a big fuss or have the resources to expose what's happening.
And she also notes, based on some reports, that the alleged stalkers sometimes seem to be perhaps from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, maybe less educated.
Again, potentially fitting that profile of people recruited for more basic surveillance tasks, maybe primarily for the income.
Okay, so that's the UK MI5 budget angle, but she also looks elsewhere, right? Germany?
Yes, and in Germany, the mechanism she points to is different. Not a sudden budget surge, but a long-standing tax law.
A tax law. How does that connect?
It's quite specific. Dr. Horton cites a German tax textbook, the Eidstoya, the 2011-2012 edition, page 60 apparently. It supposedly states that informants in Germany might only have to pay 10% income tax.
10%. Compared to what, usually?
Well, standard rates can be much higher, 20, 30, even over 40%, depending on income. So a flat 10% is a massive incentive.
Huge. So she's saying this creates a strong pull for people to become informants.
A very strong financial incentive, yeah. Regardless of whether the information they have is actually valuable or not, it could create, she suggests, a kind of runaway process.
Meaning?
Well, the more people find out, hey, I can cut my taxes massively by signing up as an informant, the more people might do it. It could snowball.
Like a network effect, word gets around.
Exactly. Start small, maybe, but as more people get involved, knowledge spreads through social networks, and you could see exponential growth in the number of people incentivized to participate.
So in Germany, this tax law itself might be fueling a gang stalking explosion just because so many people are financially motivated to be involved in some kind of information gathering.
That's her argument, yes. It provides a potential explanation rooted in a clear financial incentive structure within that country.
And she contrasts that with the UK, where the driver might be more about the consequences of that MI5 budget, doubling the need to hire and train lots of people, potentially using the public for practice.
Right. Two different potential mechanisms leading to possibly similar outcomes in terms of increased reports of organized surveillance or harassment.
And does she suggest this might be happening elsewhere too?
She does speculate that similar budget increases might happen in other places like the U.S., maybe Japan, South Korea, especially post 9/11 with the whole war on terror context. She didn't provide specific figures for those in our source material, but encourages you, the listener, to maybe do some digging for your own country.
See if there were similar big jumps in intelligence funding around that time.
Yeah. So fundamentally, she's offering these two factors, big budget increases, needing training exercises, and financial incentives like tax breaks, driving recruitment as alternative ways to think about these disturbing reports of organized stalking.
Moving beyond just the individual psychiatric lens to consider wider governmental and societal factors.
Exactly. It's a perspective that asks us to consider possibilities that aren't usually part of the mainstream conversation on this topic.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap the core ideas. We've looked at Dr. Horton's view that, one, a massive budget increase for an agency like MI5 could lead to widespread training exercises, potentially using unsuspecting people as practice targets.
And two, that specific financial structures, like that German tax law apparently offering huge benefits for informants, could create a large pool of people motivated to engage in surveillance-type activities.
Both potentially contributing to the rise in people reporting experiences of gang stalking or organized harassment.
Right. Again, not saying it explains everything, as Dr. Horton herself stresses, but it offers another angle, another possibility to consider, rather than immediate dismissal.
It definitely provides a more nuanced lens, doesn't it? Instead of just one possible explanation.
It does. It provides a broader look at the potential forces at play.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, listening at home. If, and it's a big if, based on this perspective, but if these kinds of large-scale recruitment efforts and surveillance training exercises are happening, whatever the stated reason, what does that mean?
What are the implications for, our personal privacy? trust in society and our communities if potentially large numbers of people are involved in observing others, either for training or financial gain.
Yeah, what questions does that raise for you about that balance? We always talk about national security versus individual liberty, especially now when the capabilities for surveillance are just getting more and more powerful.
Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive ends.